The notification lit up the dim boardroom at exactly 10:15 p.m., a single, silent vibration on a device usually reserved for high-stakes wire transfers and execution orders. Daejin, the stoic king of the shadows, who had controlled the city's underworld with an iron grip for a decade, his subordinates waited for him to dismiss it as a wrong number. A second vibration, "I'm hiding in the closet, please," caused Daejin's terrifying calmness to fracture. He had commanded armies and silenced rivals, but he had never witnessed a child reaching out into the digital void because she had no one left to call. Without a word to his generals, he typed 4 words, "I'm on my way." As his armored sedan tore through the rain-slicked streets, Daejin felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't experienced since he was a low-level enforcer. He wasn't supposed to risk his empire for a stranger in a dilapidated tenement, but Zuri's desperate texts had pierced the armor he wore around his soul. 12 years ago, he was a different man, a loving father who came home 5 minutes too late to save his own daughter, Minji. He had been her hero until the day his enemies used her to get to him, leaving him with nothing but a grave to visit and a heart turned to ice. Over the years, the grieving father had disappeared into the cold, untouchable persona of the boss. But as he saw the crumbling apartment complex come into view, he realized he wasn't just answering a text. He was finally keeping the promise he failed to keep for Minji. Welcome to Afro-Korean Gallery. Stay with me till the very end. Show some love by hitting like and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from, and you're absolutely amazing. Let's get into the story. The boardroom was situated on the top floor of a glass spire that pierced the smog and neon of the financial district, a fortress of solitude floating above the chaotic city. Inside, the air was filtered, cedar-scented, and deliberately cold, a stark contrast to the damp, neglected concrete of the streets far below. Daejin sat at the head of a long mahogany table, a figure of terrifying stillness. He wore a sharp black suit that was pristine and uncreased, tailored to fit him like a second skin, acting as armor against a world he had long ago ceased to trust. For years, Daejin had been known simply as the King of Shadows, a title earned through blood and silence. He controlled the city's underworld with an iron grip, orchestrating the unseen currents of power that dictated the lives of thousands. To the men sitting across from him, politicians, rival lieutenants, and corrupt captains of industry, he was a force of nature, a man who dealt with consequences that never seemed to feel them. They spoke in hushed tones, presenting ledgers and territory maps, terrified that a single misstep would provoke the monster that lived behind his calm, dark eyes. Daejin listened, but he did not care. Panic and fear were luxuries for the helpless, chaotic emotions he had spent a lifetime purging from his system. He sat in absolute silence, his expression unreadable, radiating a cold, untouchable persona that he had perfected over a decade of ruthlessness. To his subordinates, he was a god of the underworld. To himself, he was merely a ghost in a suit.
He looked down at his hands. They were manicured and clean, resting on the polished wood of the table, yet he knew the invisible stains they carried. He had commanded armies and silenced rivals with a word. He had built this vast criminal empire on the ashes of a single, devastating night 12 years ago. Grief had hollowed him out, and in the empty space where his heart used to be, he had poured layers of icy authority and ruthlessness. If he felt nothing, he reasoned, he could never be hurt like that again. So he had frozen his heart. He became the boss, a predator who moved through the city's high-stakes wire transfers and execution orders with the cold precision of a surgeon. The meeting dragged on. A subordinate was droning on about profit margins in the shipping sector, but Daejin's mind was drifting through the void of his own existence. He was surrounded by wealth, power, and fear, yet the atmosphere in his life was suffocating. He was a man who possessed everything except a reason to breathe. Then the silence broke. The notification lit up the dim boardroom at exactly 10:15 p.m., a single silent vibration on a device usually reserved for high-stakes wire transfers and execution orders. The sudden light on the polished table drew the eyes of every man in the room, but only Daejeon moved. Daejeon, the stoic king of the shadows, who had controlled the city's underworld with an iron grip for a decade, frowned at the unknown number. He didn't answer unknown numbers. His world was one of encrypted channels and vetted contacts. He reached for the phone, intending to silence it. The text was a chaotic string of crying emojis followed by a plea. "Save my mom, he's hurting her." While his subordinates waited for him to dismiss it as a wrong number, a second vibration, "I'm hiding in the closet, please," caused Daejeon's terrifying calmness to fracture.
The air in the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped. He had commanded armies and silenced rivals, but he had never witnessed a child reaching out into the digital void because she had no one left to call. The image of the closet, the desperation in the text, bypassed his logic and struck the frozen core of his trauma. Without a word to his generals, he typed 4 words, "I'm on my way." He stood up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He turned and walked out, leaving the most powerful men in the city staring at his empty chair. As he descended to the garage and his armored sedan tore through the rain-slicked streets, Daejeon did not panic. Panic was a luxury for the helpless, a chaotic emotion that clouded judgment, and he had spent a lifetime purging it from his system. He sat in the rear of his armored sedan, the leather cool against his back, and tapped a secure icon on his phone screen. He didn't dial the police. The police required warrants, explanations, and time, 3 things Zuri did not have. Instead, he forwarded the unknown number to his organization's intelligence division. "Triangulate," he commanded into the encrypted line, his voice a low rumble that barely rose above the hum of the engine. "I want a precise location. You have 30 seconds." He watched the screen, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the digital map. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness, synced to the rhythm of the rain drumming against the bulletproof glass. A ping broke the silence. A red dot materialized on the grid, pulsating deep within the labyrinth of the eastern tenements, a decaying sector of the city where streetlights were broken and the law was a suggestion. Daejeon leaned forward, the motion sharp and decisive. He tapped the glass partition separating him from the front seat.
"Han," he said. The driver, a man as wide as the door frame, glanced in the rearview mirror. "Boss?" "The coordinates are on your dash," Daejeon said, fastening his seatbelt with a deliberate click. "We are 20 minutes away by standard traffic. Get us there in 10. Han nodded, understanding the gravity in his employer's tone. He shifted gears, and the heavy sedan surged forward like a waking beast. The force of the acceleration pinned Daejeon to his seat as they tore out of the financial district. The city outside became a blur of motion. Neon signs, electric blues, violent violets, and warning reds smeared across the wet windows like spilled paint. Daejeon stared out at the passing world, his expression unreadable, though his grip on his phone was tight enough to whiten his knuckles. They blew through a red light at an intersection, the horn of a crossing taxi fading instantly behind them. Han wove through the traffic with surgical aggression, mounting the curb to bypass a stalled delivery truck, the suspension groaning but holding firm. Daejeon watched the blue dot on his screen, the distance closing meter by meter. Every second felt like a theft, a moment stolen from a child waiting in the dark. The technology of his criminal empire, usually employed to track rivals or shipments of contraband, was now locked onto a single, terrifying purpose. He wasn't just a boss traveling to a meeting anymore. He was a predator moving toward prey, fueled by a cold, quiet fury that burned hotter than the engine roaring beneath him. The rhythmic thwack hiss of the windshield wipers sliced through the deluge, acting like a metronome counting down moments Daejeon could never get back.
Outside, the city was dissolving into liquid streaks of neon, but inside the silent cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating. Daejeon stared at the rivulets of water tracing paths down the glass, and for a terrifying second, the reflection staring back wasn't the feared boss of the syndicate. It was a younger man, breathless and panicked, running through a different storm 12 years ago. It had been raining that night too. Minji had been 8 years old, the same age Zuri likely was. Daejeon had been a rising lieutenant then, hungry for power, convinced that securing territory was the only way to secure his family's future. He had been in a meeting, silencing his phone to close a deal, ignoring the first 3 calls. By the time he checked the 4th, the voicemail was just silence and heavy breathing. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the screech of tires as he had raced home, the sickening dread pooling in his stomach. He remembered arriving not to a greeting, but to the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers reflecting off the wet pavement. He hadn't been a powerful boss then. He had been just another father who was too late. He recalled the small pink sneaker lying in a puddle near the caution tape, the only trace left of the daughter he had promised to protect. He had built his empire on the ashes of that night. He had frozen his heart, walling off the grief with layers of icy authority and ruthlessness. If he felt nothing, he could never be hurt like that again. He became a ghost in a suit, a man who dealt with consequences but never felt them. The car hit a pothole, jarring him back to the present. Daejeon blinked, the image of the pink sneaker fading into the dark upholstery of the sedan. He looked down at the phone in his hand. The screen was dark, but the weight of Zuri's trust felt heavy in his palm. She was waiting, just as Minji had waited. His grip tightened on the device until the metal creaked. The coldness that usually defined him began to burn off, replaced by a searing, desperate heat. He wasn't driving toward a negotiation or a territory dispute. He was driving back in time. He couldn't save Minji, that door was closed forever, but he would burn the entire city to the ground before he let history repeat itself tonight. "Faster," Daejeon whispered, his voice cracking the silence. Han didn't ask questions. He stomped on the accelerator, and the car lunged forward into the rain, racing against the ghosts of the past. The car swerved violently to avoid a bus, but Daejeon didn't blink. His focus was narrowed entirely to the small, glowing rectangle in his palm. The silence of the car was deceptive. Beneath his calm exterior, the clock was screaming. He needed to know she was still there, still breathing. He needed to be the voice in her ear that he hadn't been for Minji. With steady fingers that betrayed none of the storm raging inside him, he typed a message. "Are you hidden?" The bubbles appeared almost instantly, dancing on the screen. Each second they flickered was a heartbeat of pure tension. Then the vibration hummed against his palm. It wasn't just text this time, it was an image. Daejeon tapped the file. The photo was grainy, blurred by a shaking hand and the oppressive darkness of a confined space. It showed a sliver of a room through the slats of a closet door. In the foreground, a pair of small, bare feet were tucked tight against a pile of laundry. Beyond the slats, the room was a chaotic mess, a lamp overturned, a shadow looming near a doorway. The angle was low, from the perspective of a child trying to make herself invisible, trying to shrink into the floorboards. A follow-up message flashed. "I'm in the closet. He's looking for me. Please hurry." Daejeon's knuckles turned a ghostly white as he gripped the phone. The image of those small, vulnerable feet stirred a visceral, primal instinct he had buried under years of calculated violence. He could almost hear the girl's ragged breathing through the screen. He could feel her terror, the way it radiated through the digital static.
This wasn't just data or a signal on a map anymore. It was a life suspended by a single thread, and he was the only one holding the other end. He didn't reply with platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay, because in his world, things were rarely okay. Instead, he gave her a command, a lifeline to cling to. Stay silent. Do not move. I am 5 minutes away. He stared at the photo one last time before locking the screen. The image of the closet slats burned into his retinas like a brand. It looked too much like a cage. He looked up at the back of Han's head, his eyes reflecting the cold, predatory glint of the passing streetlights. 5 minutes, Han, Daejeon said, his voice dropping to a whisper that held the weight of a death sentence. If we are a second late, I will consider it a personal failure, and you know how I handle failure. The engine roared in response, the sedan carving through the darkness toward the red dot on the map, carrying a man who was no longer just a boss, but a promise made manifest in steel and fury.
The transition was jarring, a visual fracture that separated the world of power from the world of the forgotten. The sedan's headlights cut through the gloom of the eastern tenements, illuminating a landscape of rusted fire escapes, boarded-up windows, and the skeletal remains of abandoned cars. Here, the neon of the city center didn't glow, it flickered and died. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and neglect, a sharp contrast to the filtered, cedar-scented oxygen of Daejeon's office. When the car finally screeched to a halt, the engine's low growl was the only sound in the desolate street. The building before them was a crumbling monolith of gray brick, its entrance sagging like a broken jaw. It was a place designed to swallow hope, the kind of labyrinth where screams were silenced by thin walls and indifferent neighbors. Daejeon didn't wait for Han to open the door. He stepped out, the soles of his handcrafted Italian leather shoes hitting the cracked, uneven pavement with a dull thud. He stood for a moment, a figure of impossible elegance amidst the decay. His sharp black suit, pristine and uncreased, looked like a dark stain against the grimy backdrop of the tenement. He adjusted his cufflinks, his movements fluid and precise, while the rain began to soak into the fine wool of his shoulders. Behind him, the doors of the escort vehicles opened in unison. 4 men in tactical gear stepped out, their faces obscured, their weapons held at low ready. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of a strike team, preparing to breach the perimeter. "Stay here," Daejeon said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a finality that stopped them in their tracks. Han stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Boss, we don't know the layout. There could be others. Let us sweep the floor first." Daejeon turned his head slightly, his eyes reflecting the dull orange glow of a distant, flickering streetlight. There was no hesitation in his gaze, only a terrifying, focused clarity. This wasn't a tactical operation or a territorial conquest. It was a debt being paid to a ghost, and a stranger was the only one allowed to collect. "I said, stay," Daejeon repeated. "If anyone else enters that building, I'll consider them an enemy. Secure the perimeter. No one goes in, and more importantly, he does not come out." He didn't look back to see if they obeyed. He knew they would. He turned toward the darkened mouth of the tenement, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the broken asphalt. He wasn't walking in as a businessman or a king. He was walking in as the monster that lives in the dark, and for the first time in years, that monster had a purpose. The interior of the tenement smelled of stale cigarettes and damp rot. Daejeon stepped into the stairwell, his presence a silent intrusion into the building's decaying lungs. The elevator was a dead husk of rusted metal, so he took the stairs. He did not rush. He did not scramble. He moved with the rhythmic, terrifying grace of a predator that already knew its prey had nowhere to run.
Each step was a calculated placement of weight, his expensive shoes clicking softly against the concrete, a heartbeat echoing in the narrow space. By the second landing, the silence of the night was shattered. From the floors above, the muffled vibration of a scream reached him, sharp, jagged, and full of a terror that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of furniture being overturned and the shattering of glass. A man's voice, thick with a jagged, uncontrolled rage, tore through the thin walls, hurling insults that were punctuated by the sound of a heavy blow.
Dejan's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, turning into two pits of cold flint. He reached the third floor, and the violence became visceral. He could hear the sobbing now, a high, thin sound that could only belong to Zuri, muffled as if she were still pressed into the corner of that closet, praying for the world to stop shaking. He rounded the final corner of the hallway. The fluorescent light overhead hummed and flickered, casting a stuttering strobe effect over the peeling wallpaper. Apartment 3C. The door was a scarred piece of plywood, vibrating with the force of the chaos inside. A woman's plea for mercy was cut short by another crash. Dejan did not pause to breathe. He did not announce his presence. He reached the door and in one fluid motion channeled the entire momentum of his journey into his lead foot. The strike was surgical and immense. The wood didn't just give way, the frame splintered like dry kindling, the locks shearing off as the door was blown inward by the sheer violence of the impact. It hit the interior wall with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, instantly silencing the screaming. Dejan stepped through the threshold, a silhouette of sharp lines and lethal intent framed against the dim light of the hallway. The monster had arrived, and he had brought the silence of the grave with him. He didn't look at the disarray or the broken glass. His gaze went straight to the center of the room, fixing on the man standing over a slumped figure on the floor. The man's name was Minjun, though Dejan didn't know him.
The air inside the apartment was thick with the copper tang of blood and the sour stench of cheap whiskey. Dejan stepped over the threshold, his presence instantly draining the heat from the room. He didn't look at the shattered plates or the overturned table. His eyes locked onto Minjun standing in the center of the wreckage. Minjun was a jagged mess of a human being, large, sweat-drenched, and vibrating with a frantic, shallow energy. Minjun squinted at Dejan, his confusion quickly curdling into a sneer. He took in the immaculate cut of Dejan's black suit and the polished sheen of his shoes. "The hell is this?" Minjun spat, wiping a hand across his mouth. "You looking for a ballroom, pretty boy? You're in the wrong zip code for a suit like that." He brandished a heavy glass bottle, his knuckles raw and red. "Get out before I ruin that expensive fabric." Dejan didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He stood with a focused expression, a terrifying, glassy stillness that made Minjun's frantic posturing look like the flailing of an insect. To Dejan, Minjun wasn't an opponent, he was an obstruction. He was the personification of the failure that had haunted Dejan for 12 years, and the boss intended to remove him with the cold precision of a surgeon. "You're making a mistake," Minjun growled, lunging forward with the bottle held high. Dejan moved before Minjun's weight had even fully shifted. It wasn't a brawl, it was a dismantling. As the bottle swung toward his head, Dejan stepped into Minjun's guard, his movement a blur of dark wool. He caught Minjun's wrist with a grip like a hydraulic vise, the bones snapping with a sickening wet crunch that silenced Minjun's shout before it could leave his throat.
The bottle shattered against the floor, but Dejan wasn't finished. With his free hand, he delivered a strike to Minjun's solar plexus, followed by a sharp, driving elbow to the jaw. Minjun's head snapped back, his eyes rolling. Daejeon didn't let him fall yet. He grabbed Minjun by the collar, pulling him close until they were inches apart. Daejeon's breath was steady, his heartbeat slow and rhythmic. He didn't have the wild eyes of a fighter. He had the calm, detached gaze of a man checking a ledger. He delivered a final, crushing blow to Minjun's knee, sending him crashing to the floor in a heap of broken pride and splintered bone. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 minutes. Daejeon stood over the gasping heap, his suit still perfect, his breathing undisturbed. He reached down and adjusted his tie, his shadow falling long and dark over the man who had thought he was the most dangerous thing in the room. The man on the floor was no longer a threat. He was a pathetic ruin, leaking blood and broken promises onto the stained linoleum. He scrambled backward on his elbows, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps as he looked up at the shadow towering over him. "Please," Minjun choked out, his voice cracking with a coward's desperation. I didn't know. Just let me go. I'll leave. I'll never come back." Daejeon's face remained a mask of stone. He reached down and wrapped his hand around the neck of a heavy brass floor lamp that had been toppled in the struggle. The weight of it felt right in his palm, a solid, final answer to the cruelty he had witnessed. In the silent boardrooms of his world, a man like this would already be a corpse. To Daejeon, murder was a business tool, a clean way to close an open file. He raised the heavy base, his muscles tensing, his mind calculating the exact trajectory needed to end Minjun's existence with a single crushing blow. A soft creak echoed from the corner of the room. The closet door, the one with the slats he had memorized from the photograph, nudged open an inch, then 2. Zuri's small, trembling hand gripped the edge of the wood as she peeked out from her sanctuary. Her face was a ghost's white, her braided hair messy and matted with dust, but it was her eyes, those wide, fearful eyes that stopped Daejeon's heart. She wasn't looking at Minjun, she was looking at him. In those eyes, Daejeon didn't see a savior. He saw a reflection of the monster he had become to survive his grief. She was watching a man in a black suit prepare to do exactly what the man on the floor had done, use violence to solve a problem, to exert power over the weak. If he swung that lamp, he would save her mother, but he would destroy the last fragment of the girl's innocence. He would be the last terrifying thing she ever saw in this room. Daejeon looked from the sobbing child to the broken man and then back to the memory of Minji. He realized that justice wasn't always found in a grave. His fingers loosened. The heavy lamp hit the floor with a dull, hollow clang, rolling harmlessly away. Minjun flinched, shielding his face, but the blow never came. Daejeon didn't look at him again. He didn't need to. Minjun was already dead in every way that mattered. The fear in his eyes would ensure he never stopped running. Daejeon stood tall, his hands empty, his shadow no longer a threat, but a shield. He had spent years choosing the darkness, but for the sake of the girl in the closet, he chose to leave a sliver of light. He turned his back on the wreckage, his focus shifting entirely to the trembling child, and for the first time in a decade, the King of Shadows felt the ice around his heart begin to crack.
The violent tension that had filled the room seemed to exhale, leaving behind a heavy, ringing silence. Daejeon did not look at Minjun groveling in the corner. He had already ceased to exist. Instead, the most feared man in the city's underworld did something his subordinates would have found impossible. He lowered himself. Slowly, deliberately, Daejeon sank to one knee in the middle of the debris. He discarded the towering, predatory posture of a boss and made himself small, bringing his eyes level with the slats of the closet door. He was still wearing the sharp black suit, his cuffs were still stained with the evidence of the struggle, but the cold fury in his gaze had been replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. "It's okay now," he said. His voice was no longer a command, it was a soft anchor in the middle of her storm. "You can come out, Zuri." The girl hesitated, her small frame trembling as she stepped out from the shadows of the laundry. She looked at the wreckage of her home, then at her mother, Nia, who was beginning to stir on the far side of the room. Finally, her wide, tearful eyes settled on Daejeon. She saw the man who had replied to her text. She saw the hands that had just dismantled a monster, now held out toward her, palms open and empty. At that moment, the heavy thud of boots sounded in the hallway. This time, it wasn't the sound of an invasion. A team of elite medics, men on Daejeon's private payroll who handled the syndicate's most sensitive wounds, rushed in with a gurney and life-saving equipment. They didn't ask questions. They went straight to Nia, their movements efficient and gentle. Zuri watched them for a heartbeat before looking back at Daejeon. He remained perfectly still, a patient monument of safety. She took a tentative step forward, her small hand reaching out until her fingers brushed his palm. His hand was large enough to swallow hers, his skin calloused and scarred, yet he held her with a lightness that suggested she was made of spun glass. "Are you a police officer?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of hope. Daejeon looked at her, seeing the ghost of Min-ji in the way she tilted her head. He thought of the blood on his hands and the empire built on secrets, the dark reality of who he truly was. He couldn't give her a lie, but he could give her the truth she had earned. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first in years. "No," he replied softly, closing his fingers gently around hers. "I'm a friend." The seasons had shifted, the biting winter rain giving way to the soft, golden haze of a late spring afternoon. The air was no longer thick with the scent of damp concrete, but with the fragrance of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. Daejeon sat in the back of his familiar black sedan, the window rolled down just an inch to let in the sounds of the world he protected but could never fully inhabit. Across the street, nestled in a quiet tree-lined suburb far from the reach of the eastern tenements, Zuri was running. She wore a bright yellow sundress that caught the light as she chased a golden retriever across the park's emerald lawn. There was no trace of the shaking hands or the haunted, wide-eyed terror of that night 6 months ago. Behind her, sitting on a park bench with a book in her lap, Nia looked up and laughed, a sound that was clear, healthy, and free. They lived in a house funded by anonymous trusts, guarded by shadows they would never see, and cared for by doctors who sent their reports directly to a private encrypted server. They were safe, not because of the law, but because the most dangerous man in the city had decreed it so. Daejeon watched them through the tinted glass, his focused expression softening into something unrecognizable to his enemies. He did not step out of the car. He did not call out her name. He knew that his presence was a reminder of a darkness she deserved to forget. He was a creature of the night, a man of blood and iron, and he understood that the greatest gift he could give her was his absence. A small, rare smile touched his lips, a genuine expression that reached his eyes, finally thawing the last of the ice that had formed the night he lost Min-ji. He had failed one daughter, but he had saved another. The debt wasn't erased, but the scales had finally found a measure of balance. He looked at Zuri one last time, committing the sight of her joy to memory, a flickering candle to carry back into the cold world he ruled. He tapped the glass partition. "We're done here, Han," Daejeon said, his voice regaining its usual low, authoritative rasp. "Back to the office. We have business to attend to." As the sedan pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic toward the towering glass skyscrapers of the city center, Dejan leaned back into the shadows of the rear seat. He was returning to the dark, to the high-stakes negotiations and the silent wars of the underworld. But as the park faded into the distance, he felt a strange, enduring warmth. He was still the king of shadows, but he had left a light on for them, and in doing so, he had finally found his way home.